Imagine waking up one morning to check your bank account, expecting to see your normal balance, and instead you see a deduction so large it feels like someone reached directly into your wallet and pulled out a fistful of your future. No warning, no courtesy, no, hey, just letting you know we're taking this huge chunk of your paycheck. Just gone. For millions of young Americans right now, that's exactly what student loan repayment feels like. It's not just a bill. It's not just a monthly payment. It's a system that quietly shapes your choices, your opportunities, your stress levels, and your financial future, long before you ever understand what you signed up for. And for investors, the ripple effects of those choices create an entire shadow economy that's easy to overlook but impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. This video isn't here to scare you. It's here to reveal the part of the student loan conversation no one talks about, the part beyond college is expensive or just refinance. We're going deeper into the unseen costs, psychological, economic, generational, and macro-financial. Because whether you're a young borrower trying to understand the system you're stuck in, or an investor trying to read the financial landscape that's forming underneath it, the truth is this: student loans have become one of the most influential and underestimated forces shaping the American economy. Before we go any further, a quick disclaimer. This video is for educational purposes only. It is not financial advice. Always do your own research and consult a licensed professional before making financial decisions. Now, let's begin. When you hear the phrase student loans, what comes to mind? For some people, it's a stepping stone, an investment in their future. For others, it's a burden they didn't understand, didn't anticipate, or didn't choose with full information. But underneath both experiences is a startling reality. Student loans don't only cost what's written on paper. They cost time. They cost opportunities. They cost mental bandwidth. They affect marriages, home ownership, and even the decision to start a family. And they affect the flow of capital through the entire economy. The unique thing about student debt in America is that it behaves like a paradox. It's a system designed to create upward mobility that often ends up delaying it. Borrowers sign up for loans so they can earn more money, but end up spending a decade or more catching up from behind. Investors watch the growing student debt numbers as an abstract macro figure without always seeing the behavioral shift those numbers create in spending, saving, and long-term financial planning. Here's the first hidden cost: the illusion of future income. Most student loans aren't taken out by people with stable jobs, established incomes, or proven earning potential. They're taken out by 18-year-olds who barely know how compound interest works, young adults who are told that debt is normal, that the degree will pay for itself, and that they should choose a school based on passion, prestige, or convenience, not long-term affordability. The result? A generation entering adulthood already financially underwater, making decisions based on future dreams instead of current realities. You might think, well, that's how investing works. You pay now and earn later. True, but student loans have one unusual trait that sets them apart: no immediate returns. Unlike buying a rental property or investing in a business, student debt offers zero cash flow. You don't earn money while you owe money. You owe money while you hope you'll eventually earn enough to justify it. Investors might look at student debt and see a stable, predictable financial asset, backed by the federal government. Borrowers see something very different: a monthly payment that behaves like a tax, something that drains cash flow, reduces risk-taking, and limits the ability to invest in assets that actually grow, like stocks, real estate, or retirement accounts. This leads us to the next hidden cost: opportunity delay. Delaying home ownership isn't just a lifestyle shift, it reshapes the entire housing market. A generation that can't afford down payments also can't build equity early. They rent longer, they save slower, they invest later, and by the time they're ready to enter the housing market, prices have risen, interest rates may be higher, and the starter home has disappeared from most cities. For investors, this delay creates both risk and opportunity. On one hand, it sustains rental demand, pushing multifamily housing and build-to-rent communities into profitable territory. On the other, it compresses the timeline for wealth building for millions of Americans, which will affect consumer spending, retirement readiness, and long-term market participation. But the story doesn't end there. Student loans also come with a psychological cost most people underestimate. Imagine starting your adult life with a financial anchor tied around your ankle. Every decision you make, job choice, apartment choice, transportation choice, must pass through the filter of, can I afford this with my loan payments? It's not just a number on a balance sheet. It's a constant presence, a weight. For many borrowers, this leads to what psychologists call financial avoidance behavior, the tendency to avoid opening mail, checking bank accounts, or discussing finances because the anxiety is too overwhelming. This isn't laziness. It's a conditioned response to long-term financial stress. Investors should care about this because financial anxiety isn't just emotional, it changes consumer behavior. People who feel financially insecure spend differently, save differently, and take fewer financial risks. This affects everything from retail earnings to ETF contributions and long-term economic growth.
Now let's talk about the most controversial hidden cost, the cost of time lost to debt. Student loans usually take 10 to 20 years to repay. Under certain income-driven plans, they can take 25 years or longer. That means a 22-year-old graduating today might still be paying off student loans at 47. Think about that, nearly half a lifetime. And during that time, the borrower isn't just repaying principal, they're paying interest, interest that compounds, interest that grows, interest that silently eats away at every raise, every bonus, every extra dollar they hoped to save or invest. For investors, this timeline matters because long repayment horizons reduce the amount of money young adults contribute to retirement accounts during their most valuable investing years, the early ones, the years where compound interest works the hardest. By the time many borrowers can finally start investing seriously, they've lost decades of compounding power. That's not just a personal loss, it's a macroeconomic one. Now, let's zoom out. The U.S. student loan system is a strange intersection of public policy, private interests, and generational expectations. Colleges raise tuition because they know students have access to federal loans. Students borrow because they're told a degree is non-negotiable. Investors view student loan-backed securities as stable income streams. And the cycle continues. But the hidden cost isn't just the price of tuition. It's the structural impact on the entire economy. Young adults with student debt spend less, they save less, they invest less, they start businesses at lower rates, they buy homes later, they have children later, and they carry more financial anxiety than any previous generation. All of this affects markets. All of it affects investment strategies. All of it affects long-term growth. For example, consumer discretionary sectors rely heavily on free cash flow, money people spend after covering essentials. But for borrowers, a student loan payment can be as large as rent, and that reduces discretionary spending dramatically. Retail brands feel it, travel companies feel it, insurance markets feel it. Even healthcare feels it because financially stressed people often delay medical care. Meanwhile, the real estate market shifts as young adults remain renters longer. Demand for entry-level homes drops, prices shift upward for multifamily properties. Investors benefit until they don't, because long-term, a society where fewer people can afford homes becomes economically fragile. Another hidden cost lies in the job market: career immobility. Borrowers often choose jobs based not on passion or opportunity, but on salary and loan forgiveness programs. That's rational, of course, but it distorts the labor market. It funnels talent into certain fields while draining it from others. It makes workers less willing to take entrepreneurial risks or accept lower pay, high-growth positions. It traps people in careers they don't enjoy because they can't afford to pivot. For investors, this reduces innovation. Fewer startups, fewer small businesses, fewer new technologies emerging from ambitious young creators who might have pursued their ideas if not for debt. Now, one of the most overlooked hidden costs is the effect on relationships. Studies consistently show that student loan debt increases financial stress in marriages, delays engagements, and heightens the risk of relationship breakdown. This has nothing to do with love and everything to do with pressure. When one or both partners bring long-term debt into a relationship, it shapes the entire financial structure of the household, and households are the building blocks of the economy. Finally, the biggest hidden cost might be this: the normalization of debt as a starting point. When you begin adulthood in the negative, debt becomes familiar, it becomes routine, and for some people, it becomes permanent. This shapes how young Americans approach credit cards, car loans, mortgages, and personal finance in general. It creates a culture where debt is not a tool, but a default condition. And when people normalize debt, they delay wealth. All of these hidden costs, psychological, economic, macro-financial, interconnect. They create feedback loops that affect borrowers, markets, investors, and the economy as a whole. And they make student loans not just a personal burden, but a national one. And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood realities of the student loan system: the way it shapes not just individuals, but entire generations whose financial habits, priorities, and expectations are molded by debt long before they build real wealth. If the hidden cost of student loans were only about personal finance, the story would be simpler. But the truth is more complicated. Student debt has become a fundamental part of the U.S. economic engine, one that influences how capital moves, who has access to opportunity, and how young Americans design their lives around obligations they never fully understood. When you look closely at the data on spending habits among young adults, a pattern emerges. People with student loans behave more cautiously across almost every financial category. They are less likely to use credit for discretionary purchases, more likely to rely on high-yield savings accounts instead of aggressive investment strategies, and significantly more risk-averse when it comes to career decisions that could lead to long-term upside. These are not small behavior shifts. They are foundational. They shape markets, consumer demand, and even innovation pipelines.
Consider the technology sector. Many of the biggest companies in the world, Apple, Amazon, Google, Meta, were founded by individuals who either dropped out, took risks early, or built something before traditional career paths solidified. But imagine today's graduates, many entering adulthood with $30,000 to $150,000 in student loans. Could they afford to take that same leap? Could they risk unstable income or the unpredictable timeline of building a startup? Most can't. Debt has silently shifted the entrepreneurial landscape. Instead of a society driven by bold experimentation, we get a generation forced into stability at the cost of innovation. And this shift matters to investors. Startups drive job creation, technological advancement, and long-term market returns. When debt suppresses innovation at the ground level, the ripple effects reach far beyond individual dreams. They affect the future of entire industries. Another hidden cost comes from the way student loans influence geographical mobility. In earlier decades, young professionals would move across the country for better opportunities, chasing emerging industries, high-growth cities, or competitive salaries. Today, mobility among young adults is declining, and one major reason is financial constraint. When loan payments consume a large portion of monthly income, people are far less likely to take the risk of relocating, especially to cities where the cost of living is significantly higher. This creates uneven labor distributions. High-growth regions may struggle to attract enough young talent, while lower-growth regions see stagnation. Investors looking at regional economic patterns often focus on tax policy, industry concentration, or housing supply. But the weight of student debt quietly influences all of these factors. Cities depend on young workers. Young workers depend on financial flexibility. And financial flexibility often disappears the moment the first loan payment comes due. Now, let's look at an even deeper layer of the hidden cost: how interest accumulation disproportionately punishes those who start off with the least. On paper, student loans are supposed to create equal opportunity, the idea being that regardless of background, anyone can access higher education and pursue upward mobility. But in practice, the structure of interest accumulation often leads to the opposite outcome. Borrowers from low-income families frequently take out the largest loans because they have fewer financial resources to offset tuition, room, or textbooks. These borrowers often spend years in entry-level positions or lower-paying fields, which means their income-driven repayment plans may barely touch the principal. This isn't a temporary setback, it's a compounding effect. Interest builds faster than progress. Many borrowers end up paying far more in total costs than students who began with family support or alternative funding options. This creates a generational wealth divide. Higher income families avoid interest accumulation by contributing upfront. Lower income families accumulate interest as a lifelong expense. Investors who study consumer behavior sometimes focus on wealth disparities without recognizing how student loan structure directly reinforces them. Another overlooked aspect of the hidden costs is the role of expectations, particularly those placed on young adults by society. For decades, the cultural narrative around education has been clear: go to college, get a degree, secure a stable career. But the economy has changed dramatically. Degrees don't guarantee jobs. Jobs don't guarantee upward mobility, and upward mobility doesn't guarantee financial independence. Yet the expectation remains, and millions of young people continue signing loan agreements based on outdated assumptions. This expectation gap affects investors as well. Many emerging industries struggle to fill roles because talented individuals were encouraged to pursue degrees unrelated to actual workforce needs. Meanwhile, fields like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, skilled trades, and technical certifications often offer strong salaries with minimal debt, yet remain culturally undervalued. This mismatch between societal expectations and economic reality creates inefficiencies in the labor market. Those inefficiencies affect productivity, wage growth, and innovation, all factors that investors rely on. But there's an even quieter hidden cost to student loans that rarely gets discussed: the emotional transition from optimism to obligation. The psychology of debt begins long before repayment. Borrowers start college with excitement, ambition, and a vision for the future. But by graduation, many feel the weight of repayment before they even secure a job. This transition creates a psychological shift from expansion to contraction, from what can I become to what can I afford. That shift affects confidence, decision-making, and risk tolerance. It shapes whether people bargain for higher salaries, whether they pursue further education, whether they take career-enhancing opportunities that require temporary sacrifice. Investors often focus on economic data, the numbers, the charts, the forecasts, but behind every data point is human behavior. And human behavior shaped by debt is fundamentally different from behavior shaped by opportunity. Let's move to another hidden cost, one that policymakers rarely address directly: the way student loans interact with inflation. When borrowers are locked into decades-long repayment plans, their ability to adapt to rising costs diminishes. Housing prices rise, transportation costs rise, food prices rise, but student loan payments remain fixed or increase based on income. This restricts consumer flexibility during inflationary periods, intensifying economic stress. When investors watch inflation trends, often consider wage growth, labor shortages, and monetary policy, but not the pressure that fixed, unavoidable monthly loan payments exert on consumer resilience. When a large portion of the population cannot adjust their spending during inflation, it adds strain to entire market segments. And then comes the hidden cost that touches nearly every part of modern life: delayed life milestones. Marriage, children, homeownership, and retirement planning all follow predictable patterns until student loan debt disrupts them. A generation that delays starting families contributes to declining birth rates. Declining birth rates shape long-term workforce availability. And
Workforce availability affects economic output. These factors influence Social Security, healthcare demand, and labor dynamics, all of which investors monitor closely. Student loans, in a quiet but powerful way, influence the long-term demographic structure of the United States. But even with all these hidden costs, the system continues because it's woven into the financial identity of the country. Colleges depend on loan revenue. Lenders depend on interest. The economy depends on higher education labor. Investors depend on market stability created by predictable cash flows. And borrowers depend on degrees to access careers that require credentials. It's a cycle, one with benefits, yes, but one also built on countless costs that rarely make it into public conversation. Yet, despite this complex web of financial pressure and economic interdependence, something else is becoming clear. Young Americans are adopting. They're questioning traditional paths. They're exploring alternatives like community college, trade schools, certificate programs, online education, and employer-funded learning. They're becoming more strategic about choosing majors, more cautious about taking loans, and more vocal about financial transparency. And this shift marks a turning point. Because the hidden cost of student loans isn't just the money young Americans lose, it's the system risks losing if the next generation opts out entirely. Colleges that fail to adapt face enrollment declines. Industries with rigid degree requirements face shrinking applicant pools. Lenders relying on predictable repayment streams may soon face a different lending landscape. Investors who understand this early will see opportunities where others see uncertainty. As this shift accelerates, the narrative around higher education is slowly changing from "is college worth it?" to "which education path gives the highest return on investment?" And that question, ROI, not tradition, is reshaping the future. This perspective doesn't erase the hidden costs, but it gives borrowers and investors a new lens through which to view them. Student debt may remain a structural part of the economy, but awareness creates leverage. Knowledge helps borrowers make better decisions. It helps investors anticipate new trends. It helps educators justify costs or adjust them. And most importantly, it gives young Americans permission to question the assumptions that shaped prior generations. Because the more we understand the true impact of student loans, their costs, their consequences, their ripple effects, the better equipped we are to navigate a system that is changing whether we acknowledge it or not. The hidden cost of student loans isn't just the money. It's the choices, the delays, the stress, the opportunities foregone, and the futures reshaped. But awareness turns hidden costs into visible factors, factors that can be planned for, mitigated, and eventually transformed. Understanding the hidden cost of student loans requires not only looking at what borrowers sacrifice, but also examining how the system subtly influences the behaviors of institutions, employers, policymakers, and even entire markets. When a society accepts education-based debt as normal, the ripple effects become so ingrained that we stop questioning where they come from or why they persist. And yet, the deeper you go, the more you realize that these ripple effects aren't natural. They're engineered consequences of a structure that's evolved over decades. One of the most important dynamics to understand is how colleges respond to the availability of federal loans. When students have access to virtually unlimited borrowing, especially through federal programs that don't require credit checks, colleges have little incentive to keep costs low. After all, if students can borrow more, institutions can charge more. And when institutions can charge more, they expand programs, build new facilities, increase administrative overhead, and invest in amenities that have little to do with educational quality. This isn't necessarily malicious, it's structural. Colleges compete for enrollment, and part of that competition revolves around campus experience, not just academic rigor. But this competition is funded by the same students who will carry the financial burden for years, if not decades. For investors and financial analysts, this dynamic is important because it shapes how higher education interacts with debt markets, municipal bonds, and even real estate development around college towns. And while many institutions genuinely want to help students succeed, the economic reality is that universities behave like businesses. They respond to financial incentives. When loans flow freely, tuition rises freely. When tuition rises freely, debt becomes inevitable. And when debt becomes inevitable, it slowly reshapes the expectations of an entire generation. Another major consequence of the student loan system lies in the employer-employee relationship. Employers have long benefited from the expectation that higher education is a prerequisite for most well-paying jobs. The more degrees required, the larger the labor pool of indebted applicants, and indebted applicants often behave differently. They tend to be more stable in their employment, less likely to take extended breaks, and more driven to secure predictable income. In other words, debt increases workforce reliability. This can be advantageous for employers, especially in industries where retention is critical, but it also creates a bottleneck in social mobility. When job postings require degrees for positions that don't actually need them, the debt burden helps maintain a system where credentials matter more than skills. For borrowers, this leads to a sense of being trapped, forced into specific career paths to keep up with payments, even if those paths don't align with their goals or potential. For investors,
This reduces labor flexibility, affecting long-term economic productivity. This is why we're beginning to see a shift in some major companies. Big firms like Google, IBM, and Tesla have publicly scaled back degree requirements in certain roles, recognizing that skilled labor isn't always tied to traditional education. While this change is gradual, it signals an important trend, the recognition that the current system is unsustainable. And whenever a system becomes unsustainable, markets begin to shift long before policies do. But the hidden costs extend far beyond the workplace. They show up in places most people don't associate with student debt, like healthcare. People with high levels of financial stress, especially long-term debt stress, are more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and chronic health issues. They're also less likely to seek preventative care, which leads to higher healthcare costs over time. These costs are felt not just by individuals, but by insurance companies, healthcare providers, and government programs. This connection between debt and health has significant implications for investors who track healthcare markets. A financially strained population doesn't just reduce discretionary spending, it increases healthcare volatility. The more financial pressure young adults face, the more likely they are to delay treatment until problems worsen. And as healthcare costs rise, these financial pressures deepen, creating a feedback loop that touches multiple sectors of the economy. Let's also look at the cultural impact of student loans, something often treated as an afterthought, but is central to understanding why the debt crisis continues. Culturally, the United States ties personal identity to educational achievement. The idea that success begins with a degree is embedded in media, advertising, and family expectations. This pressure leads young people to feel that not pursuing college reflects failure, regardless of the cost or the outcome. But when cultural expectations collide with economic reality, students often sign up for loans without understanding the long-term implications. They assume repayment will be manageable because that's what society tells them. Yet, as repayment begins, many find themselves overwhelmed, confused, or defeated. And this shift from optimistic student to burdened borrower creates a profound psychological cost that lingers throughout adulthood. For investors, this cultural dimension matters because consumer sentiment drives markets. A generation that feels pressured, discouraged, or pessimistic about its financial future behaves differently than one that feels empowered. They approach risk more cautiously. They invest more conservatively. They limit large purchases unless absolutely necessary. Their behaviors shape everything from retail spending to real estate trends to retirement contributions. And then there's the impact on families. Student loan debt not only affects individuals, it affects parents, grandparents, siblings, and even future generations. Parents who take out PLUS loans often do so to give their children a better future, yet many struggle to pay off these loans as they approach retirement. This can lead to delayed retirement, reduced savings, and increased financial dependence on their children, the very individuals the loans were meant to help. Meanwhile, borrowers who delay starting families because of debt contribute to demographic shifts that affect entire economic sectors, including childcare, education, housing, and healthcare. Fewer children mean fewer future workers. Fewer workers eventually mean economic contraction unless offset by immigration or automation. These population trends are slow-moving but powerful, and investors who understand them can better anticipate long-term market shifts. Let's also explore how student loans influence savings and investment behavior in ways that aren't always obvious. When borrowers feel overwhelmed by debt, they often prioritize short-term financial stability over long-term wealth building. This means contributing less to retirement accounts, skipping employer matches, delaying investment portfolios, and avoiding riskier asset classes like equities or real estate. Even small delays in investing can have massive long-term consequences. A 25-year-old who waits until their mid-30s to start investing due to loan payments misses out on years of compound growth, the very thing that makes early investing so powerful. And when an entire generation delays investing, the impact becomes macroeconomic. For investors observing market participation trends, this matters. A stock market dominated by older investors may behave differently, with different risk preferences and holding patterns. Retirement accounts remain the backbone of long-term market growth, and participation delays can shift how the market evolves over time. Another overlooked hidden cost is the impact of student loans on creditworthiness. High debt loads affect credit scores, debt-to-income ratios, and borrowing capacity. This doesn't just influence whether someone can buy a home, it affects their ability to qualify for business loans, car loans, or even certain jobs that require credit checks. Poor credit isn't always a reflection of financial irresponsibility. Sometimes it's the result of a system that burdens young adults before they have the chance to build credit history. For businesses and investors who rely on consumer finance markets, these credit trends can offer early signals of shifting consumer capacity. Higher debt burdens may translate to reduced demand for consumer credit products, lower approval rates for mortgages, and a more cautious borrowing climate overall. Then there's the role of refinancing, often marketed as the solution to student loan burden. Refinancing can help some borrowers secure lower interest rates, but it also shifts federal debt into the private sector, eliminating protections like income-driven repayment and loan forgiveness. While refinancing companies benefit from borrowers seeking relief, the long-term consequences can be unpredictable. A financially stressed borrower with private loans has fewer safety valves, increasing the risk of default during economic downturns. And here's another hidden cost: the ripple effect of defaults. While federal loans rarely lead to severe consequences like traditional defaults, private loan defaults can damage credit scores for decades, affecting every major financial decision that follows. These defaults accumulate over time and can influence how lenders evaluate young borrowers as a group.
One of the most profound hidden costs of student loans is the way they shape financial identity. Borrowers often begin to define themselves not by their achievements or potential, but by their debt. It becomes a psychological shadow that follows them into every significant decision, from where they live to what careers they pursue, to how they view their own financial worth. And for all the financial analysis, economic modeling, and investment forecasting that surrounds the student loan system, the heart of the issue remains this: student debt changes how people see themselves. It transforms optimism into caution, ambition into hesitation, and independence into obligation. Yet, despite all these hidden costs, the conversation around student loans often remains surface level, focused on monthly payments rather than lifetime consequences. But if investors, policymakers, and borrowers truly want to understand the ripple effects of this system, they must look deeper, past the numbers and into the behaviors those numbers shape. Every economic trend begins with personal behavior. Debt shapes behavior, and behavior shapes the future of the economy. The more you examine the student loan system, the clearer it becomes that its impact reaches far beyond the boundaries of personal finance. It influences national economic growth, shapes consumer behavior, affects industry performance, and determines which sectors attract or lose talent. But perhaps the most underestimated dimension of the student loan crisis lies in the subtle ways it alters the trajectory of young Americans, not dramatically at once, but slowly, gradually, in thousands of small decisions that accumulate over time. To understand this cumulative effect, consider how student loans influence spending patterns. When a borrower's budget is constrained, spending becomes a matter of prioritization rather than preference. Essentials come first, debt payments come second, and discretionary spending moves to the bottom of the list. For many young adults, this means fewer social activities, fewer spontaneous purchases, fewer vacations, and fewer opportunities for experiences that shape personal development. At first glance, these might seem like lifestyle inconveniences, but when millions of people cut back on discretionary spending simultaneously, entire sectors feel the impact. Retail companies notice reductions in average transaction sizes. Travel industries see lower demand from younger demographics. Entertainment platforms adjust their models to rely heavily on subscriptions rather than ticket sales or live events. Even the gig economy feels the effects, as rideshare and delivery services see fluctuating demand based on borrowers' ability to allocate money toward convenience rather than necessity. These shifts trickle upward, influencing stock performance, investor confidence, and strategic business decisions. Another subtle but powerful hidden cost is the impact on long-term financial resilience. Individuals with student loans tend to have smaller emergency funds, not because they don't want to save, but because their monthly obligations leave little room for unexpected expenses. Without emergency savings, a single medical bill, car repair, or job loss can result in additional debt, often in the form of high-interest credit cards or personal loans. This secondary debt compounds the pressure, deepens financial insecurity, and makes it even harder to build stability. For investors, this pattern indicates increased fragility within younger demographics. Fragile consumers respond differently to recessions, layoffs, or inflationary periods. They're more likely to cut spending dramatically, less likely to invest during downturns, and more likely to reduce or pause retirement contributions. These behaviors amplify the severity of economic cycles, making downturns deeper and recoveries slower. And this brings us to one of the most critical hidden costs of student loans: the distortion of risk tolerance. Whether we acknowledge it or not, risk tolerance is at the core of wealth building. Individuals who are comfortable taking calculated risks, investing in the market, starting businesses, or pursuing careers with growth potential, tend to accumulate more wealth over time. But student loan debt alters the risk equation. A borrower with a large monthly payment doesn't have the same margin for error as someone without one. The fear of missing a payment or falling behind can make even reasonable risks feel unacceptable. This doesn't just affect personal outcomes, it affects economic dynamism. Fewer people take entrepreneurial risks, fewer invest in new ideas, fewer pursue unconventional career paths that could lead to breakthroughs. A society that encourages risk-taking but burdens its young adults with long-term debt creates a contradiction. Innovation requires freedom, but debt limits freedom. And the consequences of limited freedom show up in career progression. Many graduates feel compelled to choose safe career paths, stable industries, predictable salaries, well-defined roles. There's nothing wrong with stability, but when financial obligation drives career choices, the economy loses out on diversity of talent. Industries that might have benefited from creative thinkers or unconventional problem solvers instead see talent redirected toward fields that simply offer reliable income. This has long-term implications for innovation, productivity, and economic competitiveness. Another dimension of the hidden cost emerges during economic downturns. When recessions hit, layoffs disproportionately affect younger and less established workers. For those with student loans, unemployment doesn't just represent a loss of income, it represents a potential inability to make required payments. While federal programs offer temporary relief through deferment and income-driven repayment, interest often continues to grow. This means that during periods of economic instability, debt burdens quietly increase, placing borrowers in even more challenging financial position once the economy recovers. Investors track unemployment, consumer confidence, and GDP growth, but understanding how student debt interacts with these macroeconomic indicators provides deeper insight into consumer behavior both during and after recessions. Borrowers emerging from downturns often find themselves further behind, less confident, and more cautious with their finances, a pattern that affects everything from retail spending to housing demand.
Beyond macroeconomics, student loans also create a hidden cost that manifests in interpersonal relationships. Money is one of the most significant sources of tension in relationships, and long-term debt introduces ongoing pressure. Many couples delay marriage until loans are paid down or until financial stability is within reach. Others postpone buying homes, starting families, or taking career risks because they don't want to jeopardize their partner's financial security. These decisions reshape the timeline of adult life. Demographers and sociologists increasingly point to student loan burdens as one reason why marriage rates and birth rates have declined among younger generations. Lower birth rates affect schools, taxation structures, and long-term workforce sustainability. Investors who follow demographic trends understand how critical population dynamics are to economic projections. A shrinking or aging population affects sectors like housing, healthcare, education, and consumer goods. Student loans play a quiet but influential role in these shifts.
The hidden costs also extend into how students choose their fields of study. While passion and interest once guided academic decisions, financial outcomes now take precedence. Young adults are acutely aware of the connection between major, income, and repayment capability. Majors perceived as low-paying are increasingly avoided, even when students might have excelled in those areas. This can result in shortages of skilled professionals in essential fields like education, social services, and public health. At the same time, oversaturation in higher-paying fields can create competition that drives down salaries or limits opportunities. Investors, employers, and policymakers must pay attention to these shifts because talent distribution affects labor markets. When talent moves away from socially necessary but lower-paying professions, it creates structural imbalances. When too many people chase the same high-paying fields, industries may become oversaturated, destabilizing wages and job security. Another hidden cost lies in the increasing importance of alternate education pathways. With traditional college becoming more expensive and loan burdens becoming more daunting, alternative routes such as coding boot camps, online courses, apprenticeships, and employer-sponsored training programs are gaining traction. While these alternatives create opportunities, they also introduce volatility. Not all programs are accredited, not all deliver long-term value, and not all align with industry needs. This inconsistency can leave students with debt, but without qualifications that employers recognize. For investors, these emerging educational markets present both risk and opportunity. Companies offering digital learning platforms stand to benefit, but only if they provide high-quality, industry-aligned content. Boot camps and vocational programs may flourish, but only if they produce consistent outcomes. As education diversifies, the value proposition of traditional degrees may shift, altering demand across sectors linked to higher education. We also need to consider how student loans affect national wealth distribution. Wealth gaps are widening, and student loan burdens contribute to this divide. Borrowers from wealthy families often graduate with little to no debt, allowing them to begin their careers unburdened. They can save, invest, and buy homes earlier. Borrowers from lower-income families not only graduate with higher loan amounts, but also face higher interest burdens and longer repayment timelines. This gap compounds over time, reinforcing inequality and creating generational divides in financial opportunity. And this brings us to a crucial hidden cost: the personal psychological effect of perpetual indebtedness. Debt has a way of becoming part of a person's identity. Borrowers internalize their financial burden. They adjust their expectations. They temper their ambitions. They adopt a mindset of caution rather than confidence. This psychological shift doesn't show up on balance sheets, but its consequences are profound. When people see themselves as burdened, their choices reflect that belief. They may avoid pursuing leadership roles, negotiating salaries, or seeking promotions. They may shy away from personal development opportunities that could enhance their skills and income. This isn't a lack of ambition, it's a survival strategy, and it shapes the financial future of individuals, families, and communities. The hidden cost of student loans is not a single number or statistic. It is the cumulative effect of constrained choices, delayed goals, altered behaviors, and reshaped identities. It affects how young adults navigate the present and imagine their future. And because personal futures shape the economy, these hidden costs ultimately ripple upward, influencing markets, industries, and long-term national growth. And as we look toward the next decade, the question isn't just whether student loans will continue shaping the financial reality of young Americans, it's whether the ripple effects will fundamentally reshape the broader economy in ways analysts still haven't fully priced in. Because when you zoom out far enough, student debt stops looking like a personal burden and starts looking like a macroeconomic story. A story about how an entire generation finances the first major decision of their adult life, and how that decision cascades through the housing market, the investment landscape, the labor force, and even long-term innovation. It becomes a question about who gets access to upward mobility and who ends up paying more for trying to achieve it. For young Americans, this dynamic is deeply personal. It shows up in the quiet calculations they make every day, whether they can afford to take the job they want, or whether they need the job that pays more, whether they can move to a city with more opportunities or stay somewhere they can afford, whether they can allocate money toward building assets or whether they need to service liabilities first. These decisions aren't dramatic. They accumulate quietly, month after month. And over time, they form the foundation of a financial identity. Investors recognize this pattern too. They understand that consumer choices don't happen in isolation. They happen in a context shaped heavily by debt, by confidence, and by the availability of cash flow. When millions of people simultaneously carry the same type of burden, their behavior tends to synchronize. They delay the same purchases, they seek the same solutions, they create the same demands in the market. And that synchronized behavior creates predictable opportunities. That's why understanding student loans isn't just about empathy or fairness. It's about recognizing a force that influences economic outcomes across generations.
A young adult with student debt today is often making decisions from a place that's entirely different than someone who entered the workforce 20 or 30 years ago. Wages have not risen at the same pace as tuition. The cost of living has surged in many high-opportunity cities, and the competition for high-paying jobs has intensified. Against that backdrop, student loans play an outsized role in dictating the pace of someone's financial progress. In the most practical sense, student loan payments act like a recurring tax on time. The more you owe, the more future hours of your life you've already sold. And when you combine that with the rising cost of essentials, housing, healthcare, food, transportation, it becomes clear why many young people feel stuck in a kind of financial holding pattern, unable to build momentum in the way previous generations did. This isn't because they're irresponsible, it's because the baseline cost of participating in the modern economy has dramatically shifted. And each time someone tries to move upward, there's another financial barrier waiting for them. Student loans may not be the biggest barrier, but they're often the first one that shows up. Still, this challenge creates an interesting phenomenon. When barriers get high enough, people start creating alternatives. They start looking for more efficient routes, more affordable credentials, more flexible skill-building paths. They seek out remote work opportunities, freelance work, online certifications, community colleges, career accelerators, and, in many cases, entrepreneurship. This behavior doesn't eliminate the impact of student loans, but it reshapes how people try to overcome them. And in that shift lies one of the most powerful trends affecting the next generation of investors. Because if you step back, you can see it clearly. Young adults today aren't just trying to survive financially, many are trying to build income streams outside of traditional employment so they can pay down their debt faster and regain control. This movement has created entire ecosystems around side hustles, content creation, gig work, digital skills, remote opportunities, online businesses, and passive income strategies. And as more students graduate with large loan balances, participation in these opportunities is only going to grow. Investors who understand this shift can better identify which sectors, technologies, and platforms stand to benefit from a generation seeking alternative paths to financial stability. Even the nature of risk-taking has changed. In the past, young people were often willing to take risks early in their careers, moving to new cities, joining startups, starting new ventures. But carrying decades of loan payments makes risk more expensive. Losing a job or having a slow year doesn't just mean a drop in income. It means potentially falling behind on payments that continue compounding regardless of your circumstances. This naturally pushes people towards stability over experimentation. And every year that passes with that friction in place is a year where certain innovations, companies, or breakthroughs may be delayed or never happen at all. That's not a dramatic prediction, it's simply the natural consequence of shifting incentives. When survival becomes the priority, creativity becomes a luxury. At the same time, the psychological weight of long-term debt changes how people interpret progress. A salary increase doesn't feel like a win when it's absorbed by rising payments. Promotions don't feel like growth when they barely outpace interest accumulation. And major life milestones, marriage, children, homeownership, can feel like they belong to some distant future version of themselves rather than the present. The emotional impact of that disconnect is real. It influences consumer sentiment, risk tolerance, and financial decision-making more deeply than many macroeconomic models capture. But despite all of the constraints, there's a counterforce rising, one that represents a powerful shift in generational values. Young Americans today are more financially literate than any previous generation at their age. They're more skeptical of leverage, more cautious about long-term commitments, and more aware of how compounding works, both positively and negatively.
They question financial norms that previous generations accepted without hesitation. They compare interest rates, evaluate opportunity costs, and consider alternatives before making major financial commitments. This isn't happening by accident. It's happening because for many of them, student loans were their first major financial education, an education that taught them the cost of not understanding a system before entering it. So as the next decade unfolds, a new kind of consumer is emerging, one who is highly value-driven, data literate, and deeply sensitive to long-term obligations. This is the type of consumer who prioritizes flexibility over prestige, cash flow over labels, and financial stability over cultural expectations. For investors, this is incredibly important. It means future demand will favor affordability, transparency, utility, and long-term value over short-term status or branding. It also means that companies offering financial efficiency, whether through cheaper alternatives, automated tools, transparent pricing, or lower switching costs, will thrive in this environment. But perhaps the most important shift to recognize is this. Students entering college today are entering with more skepticism, more awareness, and more data than students did 10 or 20 years ago. They're asking tougher questions. Is this degree worth the cost? Will this major lead to a job that justifies the debt? Are there cheaper, faster, or more flexible ways to gain the same skills? And as more of them make calculated decisions rather than emotional ones, the landscape of higher education will change. Enrollment patterns will shift. Majors will rise and fall based on long-term ROI. Trade programs and certification pathways will continue gaining momentum. And universities that fail to adapt to this new consumer mindset may see declining enrollment, shrinking budgets, and rising pressure to justify their price tags. For investors, this creates long-term strategic implications. A shift in higher education demand means a shift in labor supply. A shift in labor supply means a shift in wages, job matching, and sector growth. These shifts cascade into real estate trends, consumer spending patterns, regional economic development, and even tax revenue structures. Student loans may start as individual obligations, but their effects are woven into the entire economic fabric. And yet, despite the complexity of all of this, the core insight is surprisingly simple. The choices young Americans make today about education, debt, work, investing, and personal finance will shape not just their own future, but the future of the entire economic landscape. They are not just borrowers. They are future homeowners, founders, leaders, innovators, policymakers, and investors themselves. They are the backbone of the next generation of economic growth. And as they navigate the consequences of a system that demanded debt before opportunity, their actions will redefine what financial success means for decades to come. The hidden cost of student loans isn't just about interest payments, delayed milestones, or constrained choices. It's about the opportunity cost absorbed by millions of people who enter adulthood with a financial burden heavy enough to alter their trajectory. But it's also about the resilience they build by navigating it, the discipline, the awareness, the resourcefulness, and the hunger for a better system that emerges from the struggle. And that combination, a burden on one side and a determination to overcome it on the other, is why the future is still full of possibility. Because even though student loans shape the beginning of the journey, they don't have to define the entire journey. And as young Americans continue finding ways to build wealth, secure opportunities, and challenge outdated systems, a new financial landscape is taking shape, one defined not by the limitations of the past, but the innovations of the future. The story is still being written, and despite all of the hidden costs, there is still tremendous potential ahead.